Well, it's time to talk about the culture war in Fantasyland. Cheers. Welcome back, everybody, to Sunday School, a series of videos where I tell you how to read fantasy because you can't do it on your own, or something like it. In fact, yes, we will continue today talking about the books of Gavriel K in publication order and how each of those can be read through a specific lens, and if you apply these lenses to other fantasy books, you might, in fact, get more out of them. That's sort of the goal here, and after we finished the Fionavar tapestry last time around, we will now look at Tigana by Gavriel K, and the lens we'll look at today is culture, identity, and folklore. It's a bit of a mixed bag. We'll see how I manage to actually get the whole thing done. It's, it's a process. Also, we'll have to talk a bit about post-colonialism and colonialism. A bit. I'll definitely return to that subject in a future video, but it does lend itself as a reading to Tigana, and I'll try to give do some justice to that as well. So, well, as you may expect, there will be spoilers for Tigana, so I hope you have read the book, or you don't mind spoilers. If you haven't read the book yet, go read it. It's a really good book, and it does these things in a very exemplary way. All right, that's all the preamble. I'll just do the usual thing, which is, like, subscribe, do the things. If you want to support me here, there's some links down there if you want to monetarily support me. I do appreciate all of that. But, mostly I just want to talk to you about fantasy, and that's what we'll do from now on. All right. So, the last couple of times we talked about, well, fantasy as a, reflection or combination or argument within the genre of fantasy, and then we talked about mythology and legends, and then we talked about psychology and, philosophy. So now let's talk about culture, and we'll start by figuring out what I mean when I talk about culture and cultural identity, because it's, it's a word we use a lot, but I'm not sure how often we actually sit down and think about what we mean by that. So, for the purposes of this investigation, what I mean when I say culture is a collection of practices. See, a lot of these will kind of connect to mostly legends and mythology in some ways, but what makes something more than just a legend or a mythology is, the practices that are connected to that, and the sense of self that is tied to performing certain cultural practices. And a good example for what I mean here is how Gavriel K does describe the funeral at the beginning of Tigana. See, there is that funeral rite, which has a certain number of songs that are all about specific, parts of the local religion and mythology, those two goddesses and the god Odeon, and how that, combines, and how a group of 9 songs basically forms that whole funeral rite. And, that's kind of what I'm pointing at, because there is mythology, and it kind of gets explained throughout the description of the funeral rites, including the whole bit about Odeon being killed by his sister and his daughter in that ritual, which sounds very much like something inspired by Dionysus, to put it mildly, but we'll come back to that aspect later on. But that's exactly what I mean. There are practices, the singing, the dancing, the ritual of a funeral under these religions, and they are tied to stories. They are tied to mythologies or legends. And that's what kind of elevates it from just being mythology. There is the ritual practices around that, the cultural practices. And there will be more of those in this book. But that's the next part. What these cultural practices do is they give us a bit of a sense of self, or who we are, and a sense of belonging to a group, to a specific culture. And that is the next part, because we draw strength from that, because we're human, right? We kind of, want to belong to a group in a lot of ways. And in our world out here, we do a lot of these cultural practices, especially if we belong to one subculture or another, and there's all these practices that are tied to specific things, the kind of clothes you wear, the kind of practices you do, how you behave at, say, a concert of that specific, whether you go into like a mosh pit, whether you have that kind of thing, or whether you do other aspects, depending on the style of music, for example, that you're talking about. And those are cultural practices, and they give us a sense of self and a sense of identity. Now, why is this important? Well, if you look at the story of Tigana, it is all about that cultural identity, because in our world, when we talk about colonialism and how colonialism usually works, is you take away that cultural identity. It's not so much about just occupying a place, bringing in lots of guns, but if you plan to stay in a specific country, what you then try is to take away people's identity, people's cultural identity. And that's something we find in our world a lot, all over the place. It's when you take children away and put them into what you might call boarding schools, but which are usually torture institutions for kids. It's something that happens, for example, well, it happened in Canada, it happened in the US, it definitely happened in Australia, and in all kinds of other places. It's very much about taking someone's cultural identity away and, well, replacing it with a different one. It even happened, in, well, Europe, where we did it to ourselves as Europeans, or, well, the Brits mostly doing it to other people on their islands, especially in Wales or in Ireland. So there's a lot of that stuff going on because, we can live with different governments, but take away our, practices. That's what really hurts. And that's how, colonialism often works. So why is all of this important? Well, Tigana is all about that, as you may have figured out by reading it, or will now learn because I tell you about it. Because the main story is, of course, well, the taking away of the cultural identity, full-on cultural identity of Tigana. Burning its books, taking away its stories, destroying its art, and taking away its name. And magically taking the name so far away that no one except the people living there can even hear it or understand it. And it is then, of course, about how to regain that cultural identity. That's the whole story. So it is very much a fantasy story about cultural identity in that regard. Now, the question is, how do you employ that in a book? And how do you build up, culture as the main focus of this story? One obvious example is, of course, that the main characters start out as people within the cultural sphere. They are musicians. They bring stories and songs and cultural elements to the places they go to. At the beginning, when Devon is, playing that melody and does not understand or remember the lyrics, but Alison remembers the lyrics, and it's like, that's where cultural practice happens. That's where cultural identity is slowly rebuilt. And as traveling musicians, that's exactly what they do. So our main characters do have that element of cultural practice all the time. And at the same time, of course, this only works if your world or your fantasy setting does have a lot of cultural practices that are described, that are explained. Whether it's the building of towers in Avali, whether it is, obviously a lot of sculpturing. There's a lot of elements that are tied to cultural practice within this world. Its cultures feel real. And that's something we'll come back to again and again, which is, I guess, the point when we need to talk about cultures and world building in fantasy, which is more difficult than you might think. See, when we talk about fantasy, we often talk about world building, right? And this setting has great world building. And there's different layers to world building, of course. There's, drawing maps and stuff. There's people trying to figure out the magic system, if you want to call it a magic system, figuring out what magic is there, what creatures are there. But one part that is oftentimes praised when people talk about the wonderful world building is, in fact, implementing different cultures. See, for example, and we'll come back to that later on, I've often claimed that the world building of, say, Wheel of Time is really bad. But people praise it for its world building. And you have something that Robert Jordan figured out, and some other authors obviously also figured out. I'm not saying Gavriel K is like the one person who figured out cultural world building. It's obviously not. But is, for example, talking about culture, clothing customs, these kind of things. And Robert Jordan does throw in a lot of these kind of things, describing how people dress in individual places. It's so far that, people make fun of Wheel of Time for having too much about, stout woolens from the two rivers, or the people from wherever that was, that have like different stripes on their clothing and shaving their foreheads, and all of these elements are what simulates culture. Now, that is one aspect, and people often take that for great world building. When it gets interesting, however, is when you come closer to what feels like our cultures, because while from the outside, if you're not interested, culture does display is just a surface layer of, different styles of customs and so forth, a visual thing, so to speak. The interesting thing that makes culture work as an element of world building, or gives it more power, and is when you can actually tap into the whole thing more, is when you give those reasons. See, when I started talking about this earlier, I mentioned the funeral rites and the connection of individual stories to these songs, to the practice of the funeral. So having underlying stories of why people dress in specific ways, having underlying stories of how different aspects of a specific culture are maybe interacting, maybe struggling against each other, struggling for dominance, having these different layers. That's when things get really interesting. And of course, that's really hard to do, unless you're like an anthropologist or a historian or an archaeologist, and you know a lot of cultures already, and you can just like drag and drop them and build them up. But cultures have always been, layered. As I said, cultural practices have been layered. Sometimes we forget the stories that made us do specific things. Why are different, days in the week named after different gods? Like, those kind of layers add up. And those different strata of cultures are what make them feel real. Now, how does Gavriel do this in Tigana? Because I think it's interesting. There's like two and a half really interesting examples here that I want to point towards, and these are, well, the culture of the night walkers on the Ember Days, and then there is the only slightly hinted at culture of the Year King in Quilea with Marias, and then there's of course the ring dive. These three, I think, explain very well how cultures in fantasy books can be utilized. Two of these are very explicitly based on historical facts, and the third one just shows how these things kind of start. So let's start with the Ember Days. They are really fascinating. I really love the Night Walkers here very much, because what Gavriel did, cleverly, is just steal a whole tradition from, well, European history and drop it into his world, which is kind of based on Italy. We'll talk about that in a minute for a second as well. And just take that story, and that is, of course, the cult of the Benandanti, or the Good Walkers, or Night Walkers. There's basically one text that kind of brought them to cultural recognition in it was written in 1966 and published in English in 1983. That is, of course, The Night Battles by Carlo Ginzburg. I made a video about it like 2 years ago. Maybe I'll link it down below. I have no idea if I still like the video. You'll have to go with it. It's a piece of what you might call microhistory. Carlo Ginzburg, as a professor of history, does examine a bunch of inquisitorial reports about certain beliefs of peasants and people in a small part of northern Italy. They are about, well, people born with the cowl, which is well, a bit of skin over your head as a baby when you get born. And there's always been superstitions connected to that, but with the Benandanti, it is that on several days per year, these being the Ember Days, you can look those up. They're Christian holidays. We just don't observe them anymore because we've kind of forgotten a lot about how Christianity works, or used to work. Anyway, on these days, they will leave their bodies in spirit and go to fields where they battle evil witches and warlocks, using, well, fennel stalks as weapons against those witches, to battle for the harvest. If, the Benandanti win, then the harvest will be great. If the witches win, then the harvest will be obviously spoiled. Now, please be aware that when I use the word witch here, it's very difficult, because we're talking like several dialect levels of translation here. They're just like evil beings, which Gavriel takes that whole story, basically drops it in. He replaces the fennel with just corn to point towards that whole fertility aspect. He does call these evil beings the others that change, depending on who's watching them. But he basically takes that story, and there's reasons why you do that. And the first reason is, of course, it's a fucking cool story about people battling for the corn using weapons, sometimes riding to the battleground on animals, at least in the Benandanti story. It's one of those things, you read that book and you're like, wow, why haven't fantasy authors used that more? I'm glad someone finally did. Well, there's one other book, that being Waking the Moon by Elizabeth Hand, that uses the name Benandanti but goes off in like a very different direction. Still a great book you should read. So there's that story. And it is used really well. There's a small hint, they're called the Carlottians, which may or may not be a hint or a nod towards Carlo Ginzburg, who kind of brought that whole story up. They are a persecuted minority or a sect of believers, so all of that fits in. And what that does is build a second layer of culture. So you have the general culture of the palm, which is generic, medieval or early Renaissance Italy. And then you have that second layer, that older cult, that heretic sect of people that go battle for and do battle for the cultural identity and for their life and for their country. And that's underneath it. And suddenly you have more dimensions to that culture. And, well, once again, these are people doing the work for their life, for their world, and for their identity in a lot of ways. Because it is, of course, tied into that whole situation of colonialism that is the overarching theme, when Baird recognizes that something is helping the others, and that something helping the others is, of course, the spirit of colonialism, the spirit of occupation. Whether it's Brandon, and for Baird it's obviously Brandon of Ygrath, or Alberico, it doesn't really matter. It is that spirit of taking away life, of taking away identity, and taking away culture, which is the spirit of colonialism that is happening to the entirety of that country. So their battle is, in fact, well, about fertility and life is, well, more than just existence, obviously. And that's one of these underlying messages. Now, the second one is one that only happens on the sides, but it kind of gives that larger image, which is the story of Marius, who is a year king, someone who has to defend a grove of trees and is ritually wedded to the high priestess. Now, if you've heard that before, well, there's a chance that you've heard about, well, the king of the grove of Nemi, which is a story that shows up in one or two limited Roman sources, and no one cared about it much, but it's basically, well, he's a priest and he has to defend that grove. There's possibly mistletoe in one of the trees, and, well, his successor has to come and try and steal that golden bough. Yeah, see what I did there? That's exactly what James Fraser's The Golden Bough was built on this story of the Year King who has to defend this grove, and when he gets killed, the guy who kills him is his replacement, and they stay king until they are, well, killed by the next one. That's sort of the story there. And Fraser builds it all out into like a whole story about, well, fertility cults, classical fertility cults. There's a lot of bullshit in there. It's really interesting bullshit and fascinating, but as you may have gathered before, the whole idea of that cult and the Golden Bough has had a huge influence on the fantasy literature in general, because it just kind of came out at the right time for people to get like, whoa, this is what we can do with anthropology. And that's kind of the bid here. So even though we don't get a lot about the culture of Quilea, by just giving us these few hints, Guy Gavriel Kay can build up the idea of there being another deep culture, because we kind of have these associations with that specific culture or practice, which once again is tied to a belief, a religion behind it. And once again, you have cultural practice connected to mythological stories going back through time, and that adds that layer. So we have these connections to real-world cultures, some elements of real-world culture that are not too well known, but because they are, well, historically well documented, we can use them in fantasy world building to create a more, well, realistically feeling world. Now let's look at the third one, which is the Ring Dive of Chiara, which kind of shows where this kind all goes. Because with the Ring Dive of Chiara, we learn how a specific cultural practice, that being, well, the ring dive of the ruler of the island, dropping a ring into the sea and a woman diving to bring back the ring, started out in one situation, and how the cultural practice changed from just the ruler dropping in a ring into the sea as cultural practice, as ritual, to, the situation of someone diving to bring back the ring, and how that then takes over all these different meanings. It's how actions that may or may not happen for random reasons can then build up stories around them, and thus accrete this cultural practice with all its stories and legends, which is in fact how, the Brothers Grimm would, for example, define folklore or legends in difference from mythology. It's local legends that explain a specific practice, that explain a specific situation in the land, and may or may not have a kernel of truth somewhere behind that. And Guy Gavriel does use that with the ring dive to show the power of cultural practice, because once Dianora decides to perform the ring dive, that does give Brandon a way into the culture and ties him to the local culture of his island, versus, taking away their culture and trying to force the Igrathan culture on them. Well, he's not really doing that anyway, but he's obviously taking away Tigana's culture completely. So we see another aspect of colonialism there, which is a process of acculturation, where you have different cultures slowly melding in some situations, or people that are new and are definitely the occupiers of a place trying to use these cultural practices for their benefit, which is happening in this situation. So that's the three elements of cultural practice that I wanted to look at for a moment, to show how Tigana does use cultural practice and cultural identity to tell its tale, because once again, it's about regaining one's cultural identity and one's life. And that's where we'll go next. Because there's a theme to all these different cultural practices that I just talked about. And they're all about the circularity of life in a way. They're all about a going somewhere and a returning. The ring dive, quite literally, you might even call it almost like a hero's journey in that regard. You have the fertility rites of the Nightwalkers, and you have, of course, the fertility cult of the Year King. And why is that important? Because the whole story does follow that. There is a period when a supposedly glorious culture of the palm is overtaken, just like the yearly circle of life ends in autumn or winter, when nothing kind of grows, and then it kind of is reborn. That's the whole idea of these cultures. And I'm pretty sure that Guy Gavriel chose the ones he picked deliberately to reinforce that. And once again, if you look at it, the entirety of Tigana is set over 1 year, more or less. It starts in autumn and it goes through that dark winter, and then it ends with, in summer once again, with spring and summer, bringing back life. It does mirror that idea of a loss of cultural identity, of self-identity, of self-image, and ends with the regaining of that. So these are the thoughts on how culture works there. However, I've talked about cultural identity, and I think that's the next part that makes Tigana very interesting, and is probably a tie back to what we talked about last time when we talked about psychology and psychoanalysis. Because Tigana is also a book that has a lot of sexuality happening in it, and a lot of sexuality that goes beyond what you might read in a lot of fantasy, epic fantasy of the late 1980s. In fact, it does have both BDSM, bondage sex, and it does have homosexuality. And Guy Gavriel is very clear on why he chose these ideas, which are that these are a form of revolt, almost, being non-standard forms of sexuality, and being a form of revolt or reaction to one's culture being taken away, being suppressed, leading, once again, to pressure that needs to be relieved in some form or other. And I'm not technically subscribing to that idea in general. I'm skeptical of psychoanalysis, but I'm saying that once again you can connect to another filter that we talked about last time, in another lens, to that psychoanalytical lens, to read the book through that idea of repression, or the reaction to oppression in that regard, which I just wanted to mention to make sure that you understand that these different lenses are non-exclusive. You can always use different ones and learn different things from a book. And they bring down that cultural thing to a personal thing. Because, of course, cultural, cultures define individuals, and we are part of that culture. We move in that culture, and if enough of us on a personal level change our behavior, that will, of course, change the culture, which is exactly how, colonialist tactics of taking away someone's culture work. You change the individuals in the hope that the full culture shifts, changes, or just vanishes. That's sadly how it works. So, where does all of that leave us? Well, it leaves us with a book that has shown us how world building in a cultural sense can work by having stories and legends, supporting cultural practices, dressing styles, whatever you want to call it, using these different aspects. It is a book that then shows how cultural identity is what drives us in our actions, more than just pure force. And it shows how the taking away of one's cultural identity through the forces of colonialism and oppression leads to, a revolt. And that revolt will take the form of cultural actions. Once again, there's reasons why a lot of the things people are doing in this book to, work against the oppressors is singing songs, writing ballads, writing poems, doing cultural practice. That's the way you, redefine and regain your identity in a lot of ways. There is, of course, still violence, and the book doesn't shy away from it. In fact, it makes it very clear that these cultural practices and the cultural identity that is suppressed through colonialism drives that violence and turns it very, very dark indeed. Which is why there is no full happy end, and there is certainly loss, because colonialism is a bit of a mess, to put it mildly, and there will always be people suffering, and that's at the heart of this. It shows how culture and our cultural identity lies at the core of who we are and who we want to be, and if that is taken away, there is no good way out of it, unfortunately. So, that's all I have to say on Tigana, I guess, and on how to read fantasy through a cultural lens. Look at how cultures are built in a fantasy world. Look at how they connect to other aspects. Look how someone's cultural background drives their actions within a story, and maybe see what that story as a whole has to say about culture and about cultures and cultural identity. And it may give you a new insight into your fantasy novel. So that's all I have to say today on Sunday School. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had fun reading Tigana. And let me know what you think down in the comments. Like, subscribe, maybe share it if a friend really could, work with this. And, if you want to help me out financially, there's some links down there as well, but there's obviously no pressure. Anyway, that's it for now with Sunday School. Next time we'll be talking about history and a song for our Bon. And that'll be in a couple of weeks because I'll be traveling for a moment. So thanks, have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.